Let's begin in the name of the Father. Let's begin in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Take, Lord, and receive all my liberty, my memory, my understanding, and my entire will. All I have and call my own, you have given all to me. To you, Lord, I return it. Everything is yours. Do with it what you will. Give me only your love and your grace. That is enough for me. Amen. In the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Oops. We have 3 objectives today. So our objectives, our first objective, number 8, you should be able to summarize the role of education and mass communication to American culture. Now these are kind of 2 different things, education and mass communication. Your textbook combines them together, and I've never found a really neat way to separate them, so we'll talk about them here together. So in the 1920s, you have an increased access to schools at the same time that the technology of communication and just sort of the availability of mass communication opens up. We describe advances in the economic condition, which is kind of a fancy way of saying the Roaring '20s was a time of a really good economy, just real good economic growth. And we'll talk about kind of like how that carries out actually on the ground. And then third, number 10, you should be able to explain how the country's economic growth masked its economic weakness. So in a lot of ways, the untold story of the Roaring '20s was that for all of its economic expansion, it was a little shallow. There was some real weakness in the way that the economy was developing. We're going to talk about a couple of pieces that for all of its economic growth was sowing the seeds for the instability that was coming. But let's begin at Roman numeral number 8. Okay, so school enrollments in the 1920s shot upwards and pretty quickly. The reasons why were a couple of explanations. In one sense, the school enrollments coincided with better economic condition. If people are making more money, then they're less likely to have to send their kids off to work in the sweatshops and child labor. Furthermore, if people are moving from the country to the city, the kids are less likely to be needed on farms. So just the availability of going to school goes up in the 1920s, and we see that makes sense. Before World War I, before the Great War, there were around 1 million students attending high school in the United States. By 1926, so a decade after the war is over, that jumped to 4 million. It quadrupled in basically a decade. And so they got to build a whole bunch of more schools, and they've got to hire a whole bunch of more teachers, and basically we see that like the academic world really grows pretty fast. Before the 1920s, the only person that would go to high school would be somebody who was on a college track. If you were planning on going to college, you would go to high school, and that's basically the only people that would go to high school. So if you were entering the trades, then high school didn't really have anything for you. That changes in the 1920s just as like there's less emphasis on learning Greek and Latin so you can be prepared for your collegiate studies and more on just the everyday general knowledge that a person needs. We also see the development of like VOTEC and shop classes start showing up in high schools. There's also the years before World War I was a time of rapid immigration to the country. Those immigrants had kids and expected to go to schools to be Americanized. So the immigration boom of the pre-war era brought a baby boom of second-generation immigrants, or immigrants' kids, who filled U.S. classrooms. Because high school enrollment in particular quadrupled, the expanded programs, these complicated instructional needs of new courses being taught and new populations taking the classes, the cost of education also skyrocketed, and like school taxes jumped up to $2.7 billion a year, which is a pretty hefty chunk in 1920s dollars. Subpoint B, a newly educated country then used that education to go explore the world. And so you see there was a real demand in newspapers about the same time that journalism was changing. Every town had several newspapers. with an increased educated public, also just better technology of printing and distribution, you see that major papers start swallowing up smaller towns. So the New York Times becomes a national paper, not just a New York local city paper. In the years before the war, there were hundreds of local newspapers, but they were replaced by national chain newspapers. You've also got people moving to cities, and so the news changes to be more urban focused and expansion on major cities. It's happened at the same time that magazine journalism really hits its stride. It's the golden era of magazine journalism. Magazine and newspapers, while they're both print, they do different roles. A newspaper is a daily, and so it's more about reporting news. Magazine journalism is more like in-depth investigation because they come out weekly. An author spends more time on a story, and so newspapers just are a different style of journalism. They're more in-depth and analytical, whereas newspaper reporting is just reporting. And so the mass market newspaper or mass market magazines thrived. The two biggest ones, Reader's Digest and Time, with circulations of over 2 million people. Subpoint C. Radio was not invented in the 1920s, but in the 1920s is really when we see people adopting the technology. Like the price of all technology, it comes down when you make more of it. Just the market corrects in technology. It becomes cheaper and more accessible. That happens about the same time that people have more money and more availability to buy stuff, and radios, everybody bought them. And it actually ends up changing the way people speak and talk to each other. New words like the airwaves. That word wouldn't have made sense before you're trying to send a radio signal through the air. Or a radio audience. To imagine an audience anywhere other than in the theater was absurd. But now you could have an audience in every home in America, and it's a radio audience. It was a brand new concept. To tune in only makes sense if you're trying to tune a radio to the correct station and frequency. So they joined everyday speech. You've also got networked broadcasts. So a broadcast in one part of the country can get carried over television lines and telephone lines. Come on, Wahlberg, use your words. Telephone lines, and then rebroadcast elsewhere. And so you get national broadcasts, or they're relayed by radio transmitters and receivers. So you can have a shared experience, like everybody experiencing the same baseball game at the same time. There was no way to do this before mass communication and broadcasting. I mean, maybe everybody could read the box scores the next day, but to share the experience of listening to the game together, or broadcast from the president, or if there was, less common but still plausible, like, major concerts or something like that, that the whole country could participate in at once. And the radio allows that to do that. You start having a shared experience, cultural ties for a country. Roman numeral number 9. Let's talk about the economic developments here. America's standard of living absolutely soared in the 1920s. Average annual incomes went up in the decade of the 1920s, went up by 35%. That's huge. That's like every family. It's an average, so it's not every family, but on average, family incomes went up 35% in 10 years. That's a good raise. From $522 for an annual income, this is $1920, so annually, average family income, $522, to $705 in a year. That's a pretty big jump. And that's truly a life-changing level of wealth growth. And how does it carry out? Well, electricity goes from being something that only sort of like the top privileged third of America has, to most people have electricity in their house. Factories were using electricity to run machines, and the development of alternating current made it possible to distribute electricity over large distances. And so the suburbs get electrical power and electrical conveniences. The farms, the term they use is electrified. Farms didn't really get electrified to where pretty much everybody has it until the 40s, where it's like everybody has electricity. But they're getting there. In 1920, just 35% of American households had electricity. By the end of the decade, nearly 68% of them had electricity. And that electricity comes with just the way that your life happens is better. The people have electrical appliances. I mean, imagine washing clothes where you had to take each garment individually and scrub it on a washboard, rinse it out, dry it out, hang it up. The thought of like getting a load of laundry and having the machine do the whole load at one time, that's really life-changing stuff. And in particular, women who, the domestic sphere was basically where women operated, it literally changes their lives for the better. Makes housework easier, it frees women for other activities. It coincided with women working outside the home because there was more economic opportunity for women to go get jobs, and you don't have to be tied to the washboard all the time, right? Like there's some real life-changing differences there. And subpoint C, I want to talk for a second about modern advertising. So the 20s doesn't invent advertising, but think of all the things that makes this industry jump. You've got now national newspapers and wide circulation magazines and easy broadcasts of radio that everybody has a radio in. So like advertising suddenly becomes a huge industry that just didn't exist in a different decade, at least on this level. And advertising agencies, they start getting psychological. They hire psychologists to go figure out how to appeal to the public and made brand names nationwide, pushing luxuries as necessities. So like there's a famous ad campaign for florists. The Say It With Flowers ad campaign takes floral distribution, like the whole industry, and basically doubles in a decade because they're able to advertise that like, if you have a nice message or a tough message, you say it with flowers. And then people are like, oh yeah, I should send flowers. I think my two favorites, Lucky Strike is a cigarette brand. This is the 20s equivalent of vaping, right? And they started saying like, if when people are hungry, if instead of having a snack, they reach for a cigarette, then they won't eat snacks, and then they won't be unhealthy. That cigarettes then are healthier than snacks. I don't think that holds up. The Surgeon General wouldn't approve it. But they would talk about light a lucky instead of having a sweet. And it was seen as like, this is a diet plan. People should take up smoking to lose weight. I don't think, again, the Surgeon General recommends that one. But my favorite one, I'm going to put that back in a second. My favorite one, Listerine, the mouthwash. They say that women who use mouthwash don't have bad breath, and then they're more likely to attract a man, and then they won't have to be like lonely old biddy maids for the rest of their lives. Like the only thing that's keeping your love life down is your bad breath. Halitosis makes you unpopular. Playing on some total insecurities right here. And these become household brands. Lucky Strike cigarettes and Listerine. And so businessmen, advertising men, but businessmen, kind of in the sweep up of the 20s where business and economics is king. A lot of times businessmen think begin, I'm going to be cynical about this for a second, protecting their image as people of the 20s, a modern man. And so they start joining organizations like the Kiwanis Club or the Lions or the Rotary Club or something like that that are charitable organizations. That's good. And besides doing the charities, they also come with like a perk of like, I'm the kind of person that does charitable things. So sorry if that sounds cynical, but it is good to do charitable works. And it also comes the benefit that if a person does that, then they see that, working on the 8th floor of the insurance building, that person could go be a hero and use their wealth to go help others, which is good, and there's nothing cynical about that. So Roman numeral number 10. Okay, here's the fragile parts of the economy. Expanded businesses promoted mergers. So, okay, well, what's the cell phone companies that are trying to merge right now? T-Mobile and Sprint, right? And they're trying to combine those two companies together. They're not countries. It's from T-Mobile land. So when those companies, if they end up merging, they'll make one huge conglomerate cell phone company, right? Which may be really good or really bad for consumers because there's less competition, which usually means prices go up. But if it brings together like a stronger technology, then people like that. So I don't know. We'll see how that goes. But that also happened in the 1920s, where these companies would merge together. Basically, one side buys out another one's assets or something like that. And the mergers in the auto industry, steel industry, electrical equipment, utilities. You've also got like the development of further chain stores. Banks become nationalized, make it easier to do business. But while businesses were growing, there was also an income gap between workers and managers. So, okay, I know that employees generally make less money than their employer. There could be exceptions to that rule, but mostly the manager makes more than the person working for him or her. In the 20s, that gap, which I think most people accept, really blew up, where management was making a lot more money than the person working for them. And most people don't really like that idea. If there's that much money, then pay the workers more. Most people don't like that. In the 20s, there was a growing wage gap, what they call the wage gap there between workers and their employers. And that can be unsustainable. That can be unsustainable. People won't put up with that forever. And some industries had some pretty shallow growth. The iron and railroad industries, the heroes of a different generation, kind of lagged in the 20s. And a lot of people had their wealth tied up in those businesses. Farms also had huge losses. Farm incomes were major losses. And that's true for farming a lot of times, that farming's a hard business to be in. Traditional farming, like most years farmers don't expect to make money. Most years farmers hope to break even. There's going to be good years where they have bumper crops and good market prices. And there's going to be years that there's droughts or floods and ruins your whole investment. Most years, like traditional farming, farmers have had a hard time making a lot of wealth for a long time. That has somewhat changed in the last generation or so, but it's still, farming's a hard way to make your living. But farming was particularly bad in the years after World War I. During World War I, farmers made a lot of money because food was scarce, and there was great markets to the American military, but also overseas markets. After World War I, the army isn't buying so much food, and Europe was recovering from the war, so they're buying less food. But it's hard to convince people that if you're a farmer and you make your money selling corn, to stop planting so much corn. That's a hard thing to accept, that the market just won't bear that much. So production's had a hard time resetting itself after World War I. So point B. And then what's probably the great smoking gun of the 1920s, which is the thing that allows so much prosperity, but also makes the legs on the table really wobbly, is an economic tool called buying on credit. Where you buy something, you get it now, and you pay for it over time. This has happened in some ways for a long time. So, okay, the Wahlberg family, we bought our house 5 years ago, 4.5, 5 years ago. We bought stately Wahlberg Manor. And I made an agreement to the bank to pay the same amount of money every month for 30 years. I have a 30-year mortgage on Wahlberg Manor. And that's pretty typical. That's pretty typical. You can get other mortgages. You can get 20 or 15-year mortgages. My guess is that most people get 30-year mortgages on their house. That's a typical time. And so every month I write a check, or digitally write a check to Goliath National Bank, and I send them the same amount of money every month. I bought the house on credit. And if, heaven forbid, Dr. Rapp finally gets tired of my crap and fires me, and I lose my job, and I can no longer pay Goliath National Bank my monthly payment, the bank will foreclose on my house, and sell it. They'll force me to move out, or the sheriff will do that part, but they'll force me to move out, and they'll sell my house, and whatever the house sells for, the bank will take the proceeds of the sale and they'll pay off their loan, and whatever's left over after that, they'll give to me. But the truth is, the bank doesn't actually care about my proceeds anymore. They just want to cover their proceeds. So foreclosure sales, usually the houses go pretty cheap on it, because that's just what's in the interest of the bank. Okay, that's buying on credit. The same thing happens in other stuff. So, but house mortgages, that's happened for a long time. That's not new in the 20s. That's happened for a long time. Buying a car that I don't have to. 2 years ago, Mrs. Wahlberg needed a new car. I needed a new car. I got the hand-me-down. Mrs. Wahlberg got the nice car. But we didn't have a whole Honda's worth of money saved up. And so we went to the dealership and bought a car, and we're paying for it, just like the house, every month for 5 years. That's a term of payment on our car. Yeah, it's a little easier. 4 years is better on a car if you can do that, but we did a 5. But everything you could buy on credit, right? I mean, whether it's a credit card or an installment plan, like you could buy we had to buy a couch a couple of years ago. Same thing, pay back the bank a little bit every year for a few years paying on the couch. I get to have the couch. It sits in my living room and I sit on it and watch Star Wars and it's great. But I don't actually own the couch. The bank owns the couch. And if I stop paying it, they will come get the couch. And then I won't be able to do that. Yeah. What? Heaven forbid. Well, let's assume that I die and Mrs. Wahlberg dies. And so, like, she can't pay for it either, right? It's a tragic car accident. We take our Honda off the cliff. It didn't pay for the Honda or the Wahlberg Manor. Whew. Don't cry. It's just fictional. It's just fictional. So what happens then? So the Honda's a goner, right? I mean, that's the insurance company. But our house, nobody's paying on our house, but we still owe it to Goliath, right? So they will sell the bank or sell the house, pay off the loan, and whatever the proceeds will go to my estate to go raise my unappreciative children with the proceeds of the house. Yeah. What's that? I'm not paying a lot of interest. Interest rates are very low. We've taken advantage of that, yes.
So if like, kind of how what happened in the 20s, if everyone starts making like 10% more, would you still pay the same?
Oh, so that's we'll do a little econ class here. Yeah, so Mr. Chalicki gives me a little raise every year. This is true in the working world. You will go out and you'll have a job one day, and you know if you hold that job, every year you can expect a small little raise. That's a cost of living adjustment because the price of groceries goes up or whatever, right? But I contracted with Goliath National Bank a certain amount every year. So my house actually gets a little cheaper to me every year I live in it because inflation is going up. I'm getting paid a little bit more over time, but my mortgage payment stays the same. Yeah.
What if you just miss like one payment and they take it right then?
No, they wouldn't take it right then. I would have to pay that usually with a penalty later. And once you start falling behind in your payments, this happened to me in college. I got in over my head for a little bit. You have to pay a lot of late fees, which is weird because you obviously don't have enough money. Why do they charge you more for that? But yeah, it's pretty tough. Once a person starts falling behind, it's hard to get caught back up again. Yeah, I had to go really straighten out a lot of mess on that one. In the 1920s, credit is a new economic tool, and people bit off more than they could chew. Basically, you look like you're making more money. This is great. Who doesn't think the future is going to continue just like now? And so people start buying a car and a house and a couch and a Perco toaster. How great is this? A coffee maker with a toaster built right in. It's only $11.85, which if you think the average American income was $500, this is a damn expensive piece of thing right there. I mean, I've got a fancy Keurig, but it doesn't have a toaster attached to it. Why don't we have these anymore? Is that what you just said? It's true. Why don't we have them? I bet they still exist. I bet you can get it on Amazon or something. All right. Problem is when you've got a whole economy which is living on credit, it's unsustainable if there's an economic downturn. In the literature business, we would call this foreshadowing.